My brother gambled away our inheritance, and now my parents want me to fix it by giving him my share, but they don't know. I discovered my real father was the town's wealthiest man who left me millions. It's crazy how quickly a family can turn on you when money's involved. I, 32M, never thought I'd be in this position, but here I am, watching my entire family implode over my late grandfather's inheritance. For context, my grandfather passed away 8 months ago. He wasn't extraordinarily wealthy, but he lived modestly, saved carefully, and had some wise investments that accumulated over the years. When he passed, he left behind approximately $800,000 to be split between my father and his brother, my uncle. My father received around $400,000 and decided to divide it equally between himself, my mother, my brother Ethan, 35M, and me. That meant we each got $100,000. Now, $100,000 is certainly not set for life money, but it's enough to make a significant difference if used wisely. I put mine toward paying off my remaining student loans, making some home improvements on my modest house, and investing the rest for my kids' future education. Pretty standard, responsible stuff. My brother Ethan, however, has always had an issue with impulse control, particularly when it comes to gambling. Ever since college, he's struggled with knowing when to walk away from the table. He's had periods of getting it under control, then falling back into old habits. I've tried to be supportive over the years, helping him find resources for his addiction, even loaning him money a few times when he was truly desperate, which I never saw again, of course. When Ethan received his inheritance, he swore up and down that he was going to be responsible. He told everyone he was going to use it as a down payment on a house, maybe start his own business. I was genuinely hopeful that this windfall might be the fresh start he needed. It wasn't. 4 months after receiving the money, Ethan called me in tears. He'd lost everything, not just his inheritance, but also the additional $30,000 he'd borrowed against his car. He'd been hanging around some high-stakes poker games, convinced he could multiply the inheritance and really make something of himself. He begged me for a loan to help him pay off a dangerous guy he owed money to. I refused to give him cash, but offered to go with him to speak to this person and try to work out a payment plan. He declined, saying it was too dangerous for me to be involved. Instead, he went to our parents, who, to my complete bafflement, drained their retirement account to pay off his debts. That should have been the end of it, right? Everyone had made their choices. Hard lessons were learned. But no, that was just the beginning of this nightmare. Last weekend, my parents invited me over for dinner. They seemed tense but affectionate, cooking my favorite meal and asking lots of questions about my job and kids. After dessert, they finally got to the point. They wanted me to give Ethan my inheritance. Their reasoning? Since I was doing well with my job and modest lifestyle, I didn't need the money as much as Ethan did. They explained that Ethan was at a crucial turning point in his life, and with this investment capital, he could finally start the business he'd been dreaming of, some kind of sports memorabilia shop that would supposedly be a gold mine. I was stunned into silence. They had already given Ethan their portions of the inheritance, plus their retirement savings, and now they wanted me to hand over mine too? When I pointed out Ethan's history of irresponsibility, they accused me of being judgmental and not understanding addiction as a disease. I refused, explaining that while I sympathized with Ethan's struggles, giving him more money was like giving alcohol to an alcoholic. My mother began crying, saying I was abandoning the family in our time of need. My father was more direct, saying I was being selfish and that Grandpa would be ashamed of me. I left that dinner feeling like I'd been ambushed by strangers wearing my parents' faces. The next day, Ethan started calling and texting, alternating between guilt-tripping me, I thought we were brothers, and making veiled threats about what might happen if he couldn't pay his debts. Confused and hurt, I called my uncle, my father's brother, to get his perspective. That's when things got even stranger. My uncle seemed uncomfortable from the moment I brought up the inheritance situation. He hesitated, then asked if we could meet in person rather than discussing it over the phone. We met at a quiet coffee shop the next day. My uncle looked nervous, fidgeting with his cup and avoiding eye contact. Finally, he took a deep breath and told me something that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. "There's something you need to know about grandfather's will," he said. "The distribution wasn't supposed to be equal between your father and me. Your grandfather left specific instructions about you. He explained that according to the will, I was supposed to receive a separate inheritance, a significantly larger one. Apparently, my grandfather had set aside $500,000 specifically for me, in addition to the even split between his sons. When I asked why I would receive such special treatment, my uncle looked even more uncomfortable. Your grandfather wanted to make sure you were taken care of because he felt responsible for you in a special way." After more gentle pressing, my uncle finally revealed the bombshell. My father wasn't my biological father. My actual biological father was my grandfather's business partner, James Harrington, who had passed away when I was just a baby. Harrington had been one of the wealthiest men in our town, and according to my uncle, had an affair with my mother shortly before his death. My grandfather, feeling partially responsible for the situation, he had introduced my mother to Harrington, wanted to make sure I would eventually know the truth and be financially secure without disrupting my childhood. He had sworn my uncle to secrecy until after the will was executed, but my father had intercepted the paperwork and hidden the additional inheritance from me. I was reeling from this information when my uncle handed me a sealed envelope. "Your grandfather gave me this to give to you if anything went wrong with the will distribution." Inside was a letter from my grandfather explaining everything, along with copies of the original will documents and contact information for his lawyer. The next day, I met with the lawyer, who confirmed everything. Not only had my father hidden my additional inheritance from my grandfather, but he had also forged documents to access and redirect those funds to himself, my mother, and Ethan. The lawyer was appalled at the fraud and immediately began the process of recovering my rightful inheritance. But there was more. The lawyer explained that James Harrington, my biological father, had also left provisions for any children he might have. A DNA test would be required, but if confirmed, I stood to inherit a portion of his estate as well, an estate worth several $1,000,000 that had been in trust all these years, accumulating interest. I left the lawyer's office in a daze, overwhelmed by these revelations about my identity and the extent of my family's deception. Before I could even process it all, my phone buzzed with a text from my father. "Have you thought more about helping your brother? Family needs to stick together in tough times." The irony was almost laughable. The family that had lied to me my entire life, hidden my rightful inheritance, and committed fraud was now lecturing me about family loyalty. I took a few days to think carefully about my next steps. I decided to confront my parents in person, one final time, to give them a chance to come clean. I arrived at their house unannounced. They seemed surprised but welcomed me in, clearly hoping I'd change my mind about the money. I sat them down and calmly asked if there was anything they wanted to tell me about my grandfather's will or my biological father. The color drained from both their faces. My mother immediately began sobbing, but my father tried to maintain control, asking who had filled my head with these lies. I simply handed him copies of the will and my grandfather's letter. As he read, his expression shifted from defensive anger to defeated recognition. Finally, he sighed and admitted everything. Yes, they had hidden my true inheritance. Yes, they had forged documents to access the funds. And yes, they had known all along about James Harrington being my biological father. My father's justification was that they had protected me from the truth all these years, and that the additional inheritance was simply compensation for their years of raising me despite me not being his biological son. He argued that if anyone deserved that money, it was him and my mother, for keeping the family together, rather than telling me the truth. When I told them about the Harrington estate and the DNA test, my mother became hysterical, begging me not to pursue it. She claimed it would destroy the family and that I was being vindictive. My father was more calculating, suggesting we could work something out where I shared the Harrington inheritance with them and Ethan, since we were still family, regardless of biology. I left their house that day knowing I would never see them the same way again. I arranged for the DNA test, which confirmed what we already knew. James Harrington was indeed my biological father. The process of claiming my inheritance from both my grandfather and Harrington began moving forward. Word travels fast in families. Within days, Ethan was calling me constantly, oscillating between rage and desperate pleading. Apparently, our parents had told him everything, framing it as me abandoning the family, just as I was about to become a millionaire. He suggested that if I truly cared about family, I would at least pay off his gambling debts and help him start his business. Rather than engaging with this manipulation, I blocked his number. I also arranged for a restraining order when he showed up drunk at my workplace, causing a scene. Update: it's been 2 months since my last post, and things have escalated in ways I never imagined. After I blocked Ethan, he became increasingly unstable. My parents called to warn me that he was making threats against me, saying I had stolen his future. I took these warnings seriously and increased security at my home, documenting everything. A week later, I returned home from work to find my house had been broken into. My home office was ransacked, with my laptop and several financial documents missing. The police investigation quickly identified Ethan as the culprit. He had pawned my laptop at a shop just 2 miles from his apartment. When they arrested him, they found copies of my financial documents and several drafts of emails pretending to be me, attempting to redirect my inheritance funds to different accounts. My parents immediately began pressuring me to drop the charges, claiming Ethan was sick and needed treatment, not jail. When I refused, they threatened to testify against me in the inheritance case, claiming I had manipulated my grandfather into changing his will. Their desperation made me suspicious. I asked my lawyer to dig deeper into their finances, and what he discovered was staggering. My parents weren't just trying to help Ethan, they were deeply in debt themselves. They had remortgaged their house to the limit, maxed out multiple credit cards, and taken out personal loans with exorbitant interest rates. The money they claimed had gone to Ethan's gambling debts had actually been used to cover their own lavish spending and bad investments. The inheritance fraud wasn't just about keeping family money in the family. It was about rescuing themselves from financial ruin. They had been counting on accessing my Harrington inheritance to solve all their problems. When confronted with this evidence, my parents finally broke down and admitted everything. For years, they had maintained a lifestyle far beyond their means, assuming they would eventually access my money to cover their debts. They had raised me with constant reminders to be financially responsible, while privately planning to use my inheritance as their retirement plan. The most painful revelation came from my mother's tearful confession. They had actively discouraged me from pursuing higher education or more lucrative career paths because they feared financial independence would lead me to discover the truth about my inheritance. All those years they had pushed me toward practical local jobs, claiming it was about staying close to family. They had actually been working to keep me dependent and unaware. Final update: it's been 6 months, and I'm finally ready to share how this all resolved. Ethan was sentenced to 3 years in prison for the break-in, attempted fraud, and violation of the restraining order. My parents, facing financial ruin and potential criminal charges for their role in the inheritance fraud, decided to declare bankruptcy. They sold their house and moved in with my mother's sister in another state. The inheritance case was settled largely in my favor. I received the full $500,000 from my grandfather's special provision, plus substantial damages for the fraud. The Harrington estate matter took longer, but was finally resolved 3 months ago. After taxes and legal fees, I inherited just over $4.2 million. I've barely touched this money, still processing what it means and how to use it responsibly. I've set up college funds for my children and made some anonymous donations to gambling addiction treatment programs. The rest remains invested while I decide what direction I want my life to take now. The most unexpected development came in the form of a connection with James Harrington's other children, my half-siblings I never knew existed. They reached out after being notified about the estate division, initially suspicious, but eventually welcoming. We've met several times now, and discovering these new family connections has been the one positive outcome of this otherwise painful journey. My parents have made several attempts to reconcile, always with thinly veiled references to how they're struggling financially. I've maintained firm boundaries, offering to pay for family therapy if they want to work on our relationship, but refusing to discuss money. Ethan wrote me a letter from prison, claiming to have found religion and asking for forgiveness. I haven't responded yet. I'm still working through my feelings with a therapist and don't want to react from a place of lingering anger. Sometimes I look back at the person I was 8 months ago, trusting, a bit naive, believing in the fundamental goodness of my family, and barely recognize him. I've lost the family I thought I had, but gained clarity, financial security, and new family connections I never knew were possible. If there's anything I've learned from this experience, it's that money doesn't just reveal character, it reveals truth. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we come from can crumble in an instant when enough money is at stake. But sometimes, when the dust settles, we find ourselves standing on firmer ground than before.